I was shaken by what I saw after my death. Everything I learned about the afterlife shook my imagination so much that I cannot keep it a secret from the living. For this reason, I will make every effort to convey to those still living on earth the truth about how the world beyond our reality is structured. And most importantly, I will report on things that others are somehow afraid to speak about. Thus began the incredible story that was transmitted from those realms of being that living humans have no access to. And it was told by a man named Thomas Lawrence, a well-known archaeologist and traveler. In his lifetime, he had an impulsive nature, was free-spirited, and loved everything that gave him intense emotions. So it is not surprising that he was a passionate motorcyclist. Unfortunately, it was exactly what brought him joy that also led to his death. On the 13th of May, 1935, he had a severe accident. On that day, Lawrence got on his motorcycle to ride on a road where almost no one usually traveled. He was speeding at full throttle when he suddenly saw cyclists who appeared out of nowhere. In an attempt to avoid them, he lost control and collided with them. The doctors fought for his life for a long time, and this struggle lasted for several days, but unfortunately, they could not save him. On the 19th of May, Lawrence was dead. This story could have ended here, but 3 years after his death, Thomas Lawrence suddenly made contact, but already from the other side of existence. He began transmitting his messages from the afterlife through a woman named Jane Sherwood, who had mediumistic abilities, particularly the method of automatic writing. Later, these records were published in the form of a book titled The Afterlife Diary of Thomas Lawrence, and what he shared in it shook the imagination and made one reflect. Why do those who have returned from the other side avoid discussing the issues he addressed in his diary? Why do they remain silent about such important aspects of existence after death? Because this could not only shed light on much about the structure of the afterlife world, but also provide the living with a clearer understanding of how their earthly life affects the future existence that begins when the soul leaves the body. The first message recorded by the medium began like this: After I reached the afterlife, I decided to keep my afterlife diary to tell how my consciousness survived after death. Perhaps this description will encourage some of the living today to reconsider their materialistic life philosophy and pay attention to the undeniable facts of spiritual existence. Furthermore, I intend to report on some important details about the structure of the other world, about which no one has spoken in their records from the afterlife before. Thomas Lawrence also shared information about his transition into the afterlife space and the unexpected trials he faced on the other side. He described this process as follows: I remember the heavy blow from the accident, after which came the emptiness. I can't say exactly how long I was in this emptiness, until a point of consciousness appeared in it, which gradually began to expand. I saw neither darkness nor light. All around me was an endless gray emptiness, and my anxiety only grew. Then, Thomas Lawrence awakened in a world that had no form, where it seemed he was the only being. The man heard muffled voices and saw isolated shadows, but he could not distinguish any words or recognize to whom these dark silhouettes belonged. Thomas tried to call for help, but there was no response. Then, it seemed to him as if he had fallen asleep. In the dream, he saw the cyclists who had caused his death, as well as the street and his home. From that moment on, the events of his entire life began to unfold before him in reverse order. They flashed before his consciousness at high speed, but he was still able to relive every moment. This life review stopped when he saw himself as an infant, unconscious and without thoughts. Then everything darkened, and Thomas Lawrence's consciousness seemed to fade. At least, that is how it appeared to him. He described this period of his afterlife existence as follows: I can't say how much time passed after this pause. But when I came to myself again, I was surprised that my life continued, albeit in a completely different form. I found myself in a strange desert, surrounded by gloomy autumn twilight. It's hard to say how long I was there, maybe weeks, months, or even years. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was only a few seconds. Time has no meaning in the afterlife. But what astonished me the most was that the world I was familiar with had disappeared, and everything around me seemed like a nightmare. I waited for awakening, but instead, the conviction grew within me that I was dead. I used to think death would end everything, and I would simply vanish. I'm glad I was wrong. Although I must admit, what happened to me on the other side terrified me, for it was completely unclear what would happen next and what awaited me in the future. The fog began to gradually lift, and Thomas Lawrence could make out the blurry outlines of houses, trees, and fences. He thought he was facing a city and wanted to approach it. As he thought about it, he realized that he was quickly drawing near the edges of this city. This was his first sign that, in this world, thought had an influence on movement. He described it in his messages from the afterlife. I saw rows of small, shabby houses, a dim chapel, and people. I tried to approach one of the locals, but their faces showed nothing that could inspire trust. So, I kept going, sinking more and more into solitude. The more my loneliness and fear grew, the more threatening the surrounding world seemed. I wanted to leave this grim place and return to the edge of the city. At that moment, I finally felt a friendly presence and soon heard words spoken very close to my ear. "Do you need help?" asked a voice in the fog. Thomas Lawrence saw the figure of a man who introduced himself as Mitch. He explained that his task was to help the new residents of the spiritual world and added that he knew how difficult it was for Thomas at this time. "You were probably in a terrible state when you arrived here. That explains why you ended up in this part of the afterlife. I want to help you. Do you agree?" Of course, Thomas Lawrence had no objections, and the guide promised to take him to a better place. As they walked, Mitch explained that his body was no longer made of matter but of emotions, which is why joy and sorrow were felt much more intensely here. He also mentioned that the new world only kept in view things that Thomas could perceive. Soon, they reached a building where Thomas was led into a room filled with light and beautiful colors. The guide explained that this place resembled an earthly sanatorium where newly arrived souls could rest and collect their thoughts before continuing their journey. However, Thomas Lawrence's adjustment to the afterlife was not as easy as he had expected, since he had been skeptical about everything related to the afterlife during his life. As a scientist, he often perceived everything as an atheist and was completely unprepared for what he would have to experience on the other side. Thomas Lawrence described this experience in his posthumous diary. "Over time, I learned to feel happiness here, but at first I had to endure the suffering of those to whom I had caused pain in my life. The incident from the war years, when I caused a person's death, particularly tormented me. Now I had to experience everything I had done to him. At that moment, it seemed to me that I could not endure it, but gradually I began to feel that my pain eased." Thomas Lawrence emphasized that the moment of repentance for sins was one of the most important steps in the afterlife. Without it, no soul can move forward, except for those who have lived a highly spiritual life. There is no forgiveness here, but everyone is given the chance to atone for their mistakes. A guide named Mitchell explained to Thomas that he needed to find his task in the new world, a task that would contribute to his enlightenment and the purification of his soul. Thomas Lawrence decided to help the souls who, after death, were in a state similar to his own. However, he soon realized that not everyone could be helped. He shared, "One day, I met a friend who had committed a grave sin in his life. He was in the darkest part of the afterlife, in a state of numbness. I was told that he might remain in this state for a very long time and that nothing could be done to help him. He had isolated himself from communication with his relatives, who were also in the spiritual realm. As long as he didn't make the movement towards the light, they could not meet. I was warned that such souls might remain in this state until they awaken from the darkness. Only then could they begin their journey of purification and ascend to higher spheres of being." In addition to helping souls, Thomas Lawrence began to travel and search for those he had known in life. Sometimes he succeeded in meeting them, and these encounters brought joy and warmth to his soul. But Thomas warned that it was not so easy, as people exist in different levels of the afterlife, and it is not always possible to cross these levels. The further apart they are in terms of the purity of their spiritual vibrations, the lower the chances of a meeting. This means that if someone from your close circle has fallen into the lower spheres and you have immediately ascended to higher levels of existence, an encounter will be extremely difficult. The reason for this is that the difference in your vibrations will simply not allow you to see each other. This has nothing to do with prohibitions or restrictions, but is solely the result of the natural laws of the spiritual world. However, souls often do not talk about this, which may be a mistake. If people knew this in advance, they might live more morally and try to increase their chances of being reunited after death. In one of his messages, Thomas Lawrence explained, "There is no longer the usual separation between day and night, cold and warmth, hunger and thirst. All of this has disappeared. There is no longer a struggle for survival. I no longer fear death because it no longer exists." This fear should also be eliminated for the living on earth. However, they must know that in the other world, we are only dependent on what we achieved in life. In the afterlife, we only amplify our earthly successes, but cannot add anything to our growth. I am convinced that people need to know what awaits them in the other world. Scientists should pay attention to this subject and direct their efforts to the full exploration of life after death. The fog of ignorance must be replaced by true knowledge of this world. Thomas Lawrence also noted that life in the afterlife is not as simple as it may seem at first glance. No one becomes automatically happy just because they have left the physical body. Those who suffered from pain in life may initially experience relief, but in the long run, they will still need to work on themselves in the afterlife to reach a place that can be called paradise. The key to transitioning to higher spheres is the development of spiritual qualities. There are no material problems there, but those who ignored spiritual development on earth may still have difficulties after death if they continue their egoistic view of life. In the afterlife, everything happens instantly. Retribution is not delayed. The best thing one can do on earth is to develop their spirituality and realize their talents, as these play an important role in the fate of the soul. One must also be a merciful and compassionate person. Egoists and cynics who enter the afterlife will have to start their journey from the beginning, and this fate will not be pleasant. But those who have already followed spiritual aspirations on earth will continue their development in the afterlife. They will discover amazing secrets that may initially seem like fairy tales but will in truth become reality.